Good morning. I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche organization with your daily video update for August 25th, 2022. Well, in a few hours, the annual Federal Reserve Summit held at Jackson Hole, Wyoming, will be convening. And the topic this year is under the headline, Reassessing Constraints on the Economy and Policy. This is sponsored by the Kansas City Federal Reserve. It's an annual event, and this is usually where you get an inkling of what the Fed is planning in the weeks and months ahead. Now, according to the website of the Jackson Hole Convention, the topics will include economic constraints related to COVID, including supply chain issues. And in their announcement, they write that, quote, bottlenecks and shortages have limited economic supply, even as historic levels of fiscal and monetary accommodation have led to a surge in demand, resulting in an imbalance, unquote. Now, what that means simply is that by pumping money into the financial system, they've created a condition where the most wealthy people are able to have access to that money for speculation, for speculative gains, and they're able to shop till they drop. But for the rest of us, we're afflicted with a stagnant, deindustrialized economy with surging prices and having to make choices for whether we're going to pay for fuel or food or medical care. Now, they do admit that this policy has affected inflation. And they also say that interest rates will not only remain high, but will probably remain uncomfortably high. But they say we must stop inflation, and this is the way to do it. Well, the Fed so far raised interest rates 3/4 of a point in June, another 3/4 of a point in July, and who knows what's coming next. But they're caught between the proverbial rock and a hard place. If they raise the rates, this could trigger defaults because there are many companies and also governments that depend on this flow of cheap credit to keep rolling over their existing debt, not paying it down, but they're rolling it over by taking on more debt, which is not going to solve the debt crisis. But if they don't do that, if they keep pumping the money in to allow the debt to be rolled over, they're creating more inflation. Now, the problem is, as those of you who have heard Lyndon LaRouche in the past or studied his works, what you know is that tinkering with interest rates is not a solution to this crisis. This crisis was brought on by a shift away from a productive physical economy in which cheap credit is available, but not for speculators, but for producers. But if you shift that, as we have, as LaRouche shows in his famous triple curve diagram, once you unleash flows of liquidity that go into speculative finance, it will undercut credit for production, which will create shortages, which will create unemployment. And then when you add to that neoliberal trade policies, which allow for outsourcing, you end up shutting down the physical economy of the advanced sector countries. And that's exactly what's happened. So what we are seeing is the real intent of this policy, just like Biden's anti-inflation plan, has nothing to do with stopping inflation, but to use the so-called fight against inflation to push ahead their plan for the Great Reset and a Malthusian Green New Deal, one that will lead to massive crises, including starvation and increases in the global death rate because of the economic policies. Now, this goes back to what was announced in December 2015, and this is just the most recent iteration of this policy. But at that time, Bank of England Governor Mark Carney said that banks must act to prevent climate change. And what we've seen now is a whole series of measures of organization from the most powerful banks working through central banks like the Federal Reserve, the Bank of England, the European Central Bank, to promote policies that will cut production and Carney, in doing this, teamed up with Larry Fink, for example, of BlackRock. And the idea was that to set up what they called a compact, where bankers will stop lending to firms which produce a carbon footprint. In other words, firms which produce physical goods will stop being provided loans. And they will be told they must move to a net zero carbon world or they will be cut off from credit. Now, just an example of this is Carney's speech to the UN Climate Action Summit in September 2019. Now, this was after the famous August 2019 Jackson Hole event, which I'll mention in just a moment. But Carney at this climate change conference said the following: firms that align their business models to the transition to a net zero carbon world will be rewarded handsomely. Those that fail to adapt will cease to exist. In other words, cut off credit to firms that don't go along with the climate change hysteria. Now, what Carney announced in the period immediately after that is that there will be a pool of funds for the green transition. And this is the same banks that are going to stop lending to physical production will put together a speculative fund that will bet on carbon levels, that will move for shutting down fossil fuel use and moving instead into so-called renewable energy systems, which are unreliable and inadequate. Now, just a little background on Carney. In February 2008, he became chairman or governor of the Bank of Canada. And as the financial crisis hit that year, he was the first one to move to zero interest rates. And this supposedly saved the Canadian economy. Well, what it did is actually push into 2012 and 2013 a deadly stagnation, which the economy has not yet recovered from. But for doing that, he was then promoted to become head of the Bank of England. In 2012, he was also appointed to be a coordinator of the World Economic Forum. Then he became UN climate czar when he left the Bank of England. And in doing this, he partnered with the largest banks in the world to set up what was called the Task Force on Climate-Related Disclosure. And this is central to understanding what the Great Reset is. In August 2019, the decision was made, it was announced at the Jackson Hole Conference, to move ahead with the plan to protect the speculative system and to shut down the productive system. They called this the Great Reset. And what they said at that time is that the problem is governments are spending too much money, and the money is going to physical production. It's going to carbon in producing products. And instead, we have to move to a zero carbon world. So what did they propose? Zero interest rates for speculation, but no credit for physical economy. Now, since then, we've seen a spiral upward of inflation, as in the United States, trillions of dollars, as much as $20+ trillion has been pumped into the financial system. How much of that ended up in goods producing? Virtually none. Instead, it ended up in speculation. The result is inflation has gone upward, because when you just print money with nothing backing it, and then use that money for speculative trades, you're creating inflation. And the forecast is that in the United Kingdom, for example, inflation will hit 18% by the end of this year. For Germany, it may be 12 to 15%. Actually, in Germany, in many goods, fuel and food, it's higher than that right now. The euro just hit a 20-year low. And they're blaming this on energy shortages, which of course they blame on Putin. But the fact is that speculation is pushing the prices of fuel up, at the same time that energy production is being slashed by the European Union green policy. German Chancellor Scholz went to Canada yesterday to beg Prime Minister Trudeau to send some liquid natural gas to Germany. Trudeau said no. I mean, partly because this is not an easy thing to do, But secondly, there's not enough LNG to make up for the shortfall that Germany is going to get by shutting down its remaining 3 nuclear plants, moving against coal, and cutting off fossil fuel use. So it's the green policy combined with the so-called inflation policy, now the anti-inflation policy to push more green investment, which is causing these shortages, causing the inflation, and leading to a breakdown of the transatlantic economy. Now, when you look at this, what you see is stupidity compounded by evil. The commitment to reduce population, which is what the Malthusian idea is. You manipulate things such as energy, such as credit, and you use that to create shortages, which will soon mean millions will starve to death on the planet. Now, the alternative is credit for physical production, and I'll discuss this a little bit more tomorrow when I take your questions. Tomorrow is Friday. Please send me your questions at harleysch@gmail.com. Now, let me just finish with a bit of an uplifting note. It's actually not uplifting at all. It should cause many of you to jump into action. The probable new prime minister in the United Kingdom is going to be Liz Truss, who will be the replacement for Boris Johnson. You thought Johnson was bad? Wait till this woman gets in there. She was asked at a campaign event if she has the stomach to launch nuclear war if necessary. And she said, yes, I'm ready to push the nuclear button. Well, that's exactly what we need, another psychotic war hawk in a position of influence in a transatlantic nation. So send me your questions. I'll be back tomorrow for the Friday question session.